Olá, bem-vindos ao programa Diálogos. O convidado de hoje é uma pessoa muito especial. É talvez o intelectual americano mais conhecido no mundo e mais respeitado. Vamos ver de quem se trata. Temos aí o professor Chomsky. Welcome, Mr. Chomsky. It's an honor for me to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be with you.
Tell me, after 6 months of the Trump government, it's possible to say what about Trump, the administration, the Trump administration?
Well, there's, on the one hand, Trump, and the other hand, the administration, and they're somewhat different. Trump is basically a showman. He wants to make sure that every day he's right at the top of the television news. They concentrate on him, and the headlines are about him. And that means doing one strange performance after another. That's the only way to keep the television cameras focused on you. And it works. If you look over the past 6 months, every day, turn on BBC, look at the New York Times, that's the
Twitters.
That's what it starts with.
But his administration, his
The administration
politics.
is something else. You have to look at people like Paul Ryan, who was Svengali behind the administration. He's there. He represents the most savage wing of the traditional Republican Party, the wing that's deeply dedicated to providing support for private power, corporate power, and everything else can be dismissed. In fact, if you look at his actual proposals for the budget, they essentially eliminate the federal budget, except for the military and support for private wealth and corporate power. And step by step, that's what they're doing. You take a look every day, usually by stealth, something is happening. So, for example, while all attention was focused on the Twitters about transgenders in the military, his Secretary of Commerce quietly enacted rules which will pretty much destroy the fishing industry in the Atlantic coast, eliminating the regulations that have been controlling the level of fishing to prevent overfishing.
The agenda of the government is Paul Ryan's.
It's Ryan, McConnell. It's a kind of a wing, an extremist, rather savage wing of the Republican Party.
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon is, nobody knows just what he's doing. He's a figure in the background, maybe Rasputin, if you want an analogy, he has his own picture, very clear, he's explicit. He wants a white Christian America, nothing else belongs. He and, in fact, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, agreed on this. And they're acting in the background in one or another way. But if you look at the cabinet, it's Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, the most conservative, reactionary elements of the Republican Party. Actually, what's going on with the health bill is very instructive. Every proposal that's coming from the Republicans, as soon as it's analyzed by the Congressional Budget Office, turns out it's eliminating health care for 20 or 30 million people. The U.S. system is already, the health system is a scandal. It's about twice the per capita cost of other comparable countries and relatively poor outcomes. The Obama changes improved it somewhat. But for 7 years, the Republicans have had one prime commitment on their agenda: destroy that. Partly because Obama initiated it, and they have to eliminate Obama.
And in terms of foreign policy, what can you say about Trump, the Trump foreign policy?
Well, Actually, in some aspects of foreign policy, I think his position is somewhat more sensible, whatever the reasons are for it. He has made efforts to try to reduce tensions with Russia, which makes very good sense. The threat of accidental war on the Russian border is very high. Any serious strategic analyst is terrified by the prospects. And while Congress, including the Democrats, is acting to increase the tensions, Trump seems to be trying to control and limit them, whatever his reasons may be. It's very hard to figure out his reasons.
But speculate a bit for us. Do you think that why this appeasement with Russia, with Putin?
Probably because he admires a strong authoritarian leader, maybe business interests. But whatever the reasons, reducing the tensions does make sense. In the case of other areas, we're regularly informed daily that the major threat that we face is North Korea.
And the tensions are growing up there.
And the tensions are developing. Now, there happens to be a very simple way of approaching the North Korean dilemma, namely accept the North Korean offer to do exactly what we're asking them to do. We're demanding that they freeze their nuclear weapons and missile programs, and that's exactly what they've offered. China and North Korea have proposed that. In fact, they did 2 years ago under Obama. It was rejected then, it's rejected now. And the reason it's rejected is because there's a quid pro quo that the United States call off threatening military maneuvers right at the North Korean border. Trump, for example, has even escalated that by sending nuclear-capable B-52s to fly right at the border, ships near the border and so on. North Korea may be the worst regime in the world, but they want to, the regime wants to survive, okay? So one perfectly sensible possibility would be to accept the Chinese-North Korean offer for freezing their programs and move on towards negotiations which might carry things forward. And they might succeed. If you look at the record, the actual record, it does show that whatever one thinks about the regime, they play a kind of tit-for-tat game. If you offer them something, they give something back.
You are a critic of Obama. It's possible to compare the Obama administration, 8 years, with the 6 months of Trump?
The 6 months of Trump are a real horror story. Domestically, it's just tearing to shreds every constructive element in social and economic policy. I mean, the cutting back of, the worst element, the most dangerous element, is his position on climate. And that's not Trump. That's the Paris conference. That's the Republican Party. You take a look at the primaries last year. Every single candidate, without exception, either denied that what is happening, or said maybe it is, but we shouldn't do anything about it. In fact, the Paris negotiations, which you mentioned, were aimed at a verifiable treaty, but they couldn't reach it because the Republican Congress wouldn't accept it. Trump is an extreme example of Republican denialism. And this is a matter of survival of the species.
Today, what's most danger? The climate catastrophe or the nuclear weapons?
Both.
Both.
They're different in character. The climate catastrophe is coming unless we do something about it. Nuclear war is a threat that we've been living with for 70 years. And if you look at the record, which is shocking, there has been case after case of very close approach to disaster. I mean, there is very significant information that, unfortunately, the media are simply not reporting. So, for example, in March, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the main scientific journal dealing with strategic nuclear weapons, had an extremely important article in which some of the leading specialists on the topic analyzed the modernization programs that Obama instituted and that Trump is carrying forward. And what they showed is that the kill capacity has increased enormously to the point where there is now a first strike capacity, which would wipe out the Russian deterrent. And as they point out, this erodes the very slender thread on which stability has hung for many years. It means that, as they put it, this is the kind of program that would be carried out by a state aiming at a first strike, which will eliminate any retaliation. The Russians, of course, understand that. This is extremely dangerous.
Nós vamos fazer pequeno intervalo e já voltamos com o professor Noam Chomsky. Voltamos com o professor Noam Chomsky, linguista e ativista político americano. Professor Chomsky, tell me, do you think that there is a decadence of the American empire in the world, his power?
That's a little misleading. The American empire hit its peak of power in 1945. At that point, the United States had probably about half of the wealth of the world, total security, controlled the hemisphere, the oceans, the opposite sides of the oceans. Other industrial powers had been seriously harmed or virtually destroyed. The U.S. economy boomed during the war. Manufacturing quadrupled. It was laid the basis for enormous post-war expansion. That was the peak of American power. It started to decline almost immediately. The first significant decline was in 1949.
China.
When what is called, interestingly, the loss of China, a very interesting and revealing phrase. And that's the basis for McCarthyism and who was responsible for the loss of China and so on. And gradually the world began to recover from wartime disaster. Decolonization proceeded in its agonizing way. The world got more diverse. If you reach, say, 1970, the world was economically tripolar. There was a North American base of power based in the United States, European base centered in Germany, East Asian base at that time centered in Japan, now including the East Asian tigers in China, and U.S. wealth was maybe 20% of the world. That's still enormous, but not 50%. Of course, U.S. And since then it's kind of stabilized. This is misleading, however, in several ways.
Why?
Well, one reason is that the traditional measure of national economic power is in terms of what are called national accounts, like gross domestic product. But the way the world has changed in the last 20 years, that's no longer a very accurate measure. If you look at the world economy from a different point of view, who owns the world? Turns out that U.S. corporations, multinationals, own about 50% of the world economy. Now, that's not U.S. power, but it's corporate power based in the U.S. Furthermore, if you look at the military dimension, the U.S. is nobody's even close.
What do you think is the place of Latin America, of Brazil, in this world?
That's a choice that Latin America has to make. If you go back a century, 1920s, read the Wall Street Journal, they were describing Brazil as the potential colossus of the South, comparable to the colossus of the North. Had huge resources, faced no real external dangers, politically sophisticated, educated populations, every reason for it to become, especially Brazil, but all of Latin America, another center of power in the world. It hasn't happened. In fact, the one time it really began to happen was during Lula's government, when along with his very competent foreign secretaries, Cesar Amorim, the Lula government was able to turn Brazil into one of the significant actors on the world stage. But it simply has not been sustainable.
Why?
In fact, it's very striking to see why. It's interesting, for example, to compare, say, East Asia with Latin America, say Brazil with South Korea. If you go back, say, to 1960, South Korea was at the level of a poor African country. Take a look, Brazil was much richer per capita. I mean, it's highly unequal in Brazil, but you know, overall, the average per capita income was much higher. The next 20 years, 1960 to 1980, both countries had a substantial growth rate, pretty comparable. Then it stops. South Korea continues to grow and develop, becomes a major industrial power. Brazil went through the famous 2 lost decades. By now, Brazilian per capita income is, I think, a quarter or half of South Korea's. And this is across the board, Latin America and East Asia.
Yes.
If you ask why, I think there has been good analysis of it. Latin America has never controlled its elites. The wealthy sectors basically have no responsibility to the country. They do what they want. They export capital, they import luxury goods. The East Asia is quite different. They're under control.
But why the populism, the left populism in Latin America did not work at the end? Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, even Bolivia. Why this end, melancholic end?
I don't think it's an end. I think it's
don't you think it's
a period of regression. But there are a lot of achievements which I think will remain. So take Brazil. Lots of things were wrong, but many things were good. So there was a sharp decrease in poverty, improvement in educational standards.
But they lost the power, and there is a regression now.
There's a regression, but I suspect it'll come back. I don't think this has happened over and over. The fundamental reason is the failure of Latin American societies to control the concentrations of wealth and capital and elite power, and to deal with the radical problem of inequality. I mean, the Latin American countries have ample resources. They're in a much better position to develop than East Asia. No enemies. However, the policies that have been pursued have been quite different. So in East Asia, for example, say South Korea, Taiwan, they followed the Japanese model. They welcomed investment, but it was targeted. It was used under careful planning for development. At the same time, Latin America was importing capital, but luxury goods, not capital goods, and not targeting them.
Do you think that corruption is the main problem in Latin America or not?
It's a problem, a serious problem, but it's a problem everywhere.
Everywhere.
I mean,
even in Spain.
Even in the United States, it's dramatic. Depends what we call corruption. Like take Apple Computers, the biggest company in the world. They succeed in barely paying any taxes, but we don't call it corruption. What it amounts to is establishing an office in Ireland and saying that's the company, or putting in the 1990s, just as an illustration, there was a period, you may recall, of great enthusiasm about emerging markets and how wonderful it was to invest in emerging markets, in Latin America in particular. So out of curiosity, I subscribed to the Department of Commerce regular reports. They give detailed reports of every economic statistic you can imagine. And one of them is foreign direct investment in the Western Hemisphere, excluding Canada, which is part of Europe. And it was very interesting. Turned out about 25% of it went to Bermuda. 15% went to the British Caribbean islands. 10% went to Panama. That wasn't to build steel mills.
And
we
it's
don't
corruption.
We don't call it corruption.
Yeah.
And that's a huge amount of money. You know.
One last question, Mr. Chomsky. After so many years, you are 88 years old, a young man. Do you think that the human species are getting better? That we are happier today than in the past?
Happier is hard to judge,
yes.
but I think there have been advances. So, for example, 50% of the world's population are women. There have been great advances in women's rights. Civil rights generally, there's been substantial improvement. There's now serious concern for the very significant threat of environmental catastrophe. 50 years ago, there was nothing. There's much more opposition. Take the United States. Opposition to aggression is far higher than it was in the past. The United States could not possibly do something like the invasion of Indochina, the worst crime since the Second World War. That's out of the question. Lots of things to criticize, some of them pretty awful, but there's a general slow improvement with periods of regression.
You are an optimist, so.
The choices are to be an optimist and to do what you can to make things better, or to be a pessimist and ensure that the worst will happen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I'm an admirer. I study your work as linguist, and I admire your intellectually. Nós ficamos por aqui e voltamos na próxima quinta-feira, depois de termos a honra de termos recebido o professor Noam Chomsky. Até lá!